Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Anna Allred, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar will be on October 20th. Watch out for the 6 Dangerous DNA Myth Part 1 with James Baker. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on 5 minutes or 5 hours, stop by mistakes before they start. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history. Somewhat to her surprise, she discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library and presents at other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she's a regular contributor to the Family Search blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Her current work assignment includes developing training used on mobile devices. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and fall leaves. Kathryn, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Anna, so much. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, you should be able to see the slide deck, everybody, and welcome. It's so good to have you with us. I have been so excited about this webinar because I feel like there's a great need for the information that we're going to talk about today, especially some misconceptions that we're going to address. So let's dive in and see what's on the agenda for today. If I can get my mouse over to the right place, there we go. So first of all, I'm going to ask you if you've ever seen something like this, and probably a lot of you will have seen this example that I'm going to show you. It'll kind of set the stage for the topics that we're going to discuss today. And then we'll talk about a principle that we may not like that much, but it's true in life and it's true in family history, that we can either pay up front or we can pay later, and the later payment almost always comes with interest, sometimes substantially. And then finally, we're going to look at 2 examples of preventable problems and also how they were fixed and how to avoid them in the future. So have you ever signed into Family Tree and brought up a person page and seen something like this? A bunch of red exclamation marks over on the right-hand side showing that there are numerous errors. You look down in the other section and you see that there are residences that are conflicting, that this person apparently lived in 2 places at the same time in multiple years. And then also, as we look at the family, we notice that he's got a wife up here, but then he's got another like invisible wife or placeholder wife, we could say, with another child who doesn't show up with the first set of children. And he's got siblings that were born before his parents were even married. So this record is obviously a bit messed up. And it's unfortunately pretty frequent to find things like that in Family Tree. So the principle that we want to point out here is that mistakes, it very likely once I dug into that record for Samuel Hibbert, it turned out that the problem was multiple bad merges over multiple generations. There were about 4 men by the name of Samuel Hibbert who lived at that time in England, and all of them married women named Elizabeth. They did have different last names, but if you've done any English research, you know that at that time period, Elizabeth was a very, very common name. And so I'm sure with the best of intentions, people had assumed that, oh, Samuel Hibbert, if he married Elizabeth, then these 4 guys must be the same person, and they were all merged together. And speaking from experience, I can bet that it did not take very much time to do those multiple bad merges. But the trouble is, those mistakes that were made in 5 minutes can take up to 5 hours or longer to fix. So that leads us to the principle that we sometimes don't like, but it tends to be true in life. And that is that we can pay up front or we can put off the payment. And later on, we're going to have to pay it anyway, but we're going to have to pay it with interest. So the truth of life is that that payment with the interest always comes due. There's no way to avoid it. The only difference is in family history, sometimes to mix metaphors here, we can do a hit and run if we're not careful. So we cut corners up front, but in the long run, it makes a mess and somebody else is left to clean up that mess that we've created. So really the best time to stop a problem in family tree is actually before it starts. So it's worth asking, why do these problems happen? I'll tell you first off why I've observed that they don't happen. So I've been working with beginners for gosh, close to 20 years now. What I've noticed is that these problems almost never happen because someone was malicious. In other words, they didn't wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to get in family tree and I am just going to create a huge mess. No, very, very, very few people do that. I have heard of cases where someone had a grudge against someone and went in and messed up their tree, but that is very, very rare. It's by far the exception. So the problems that we see are generally not caused by any kind of malice. They're also not due to lack of intelligence. I know sometimes we might feel a little bit differently when we get in and we see a mess. We go, oh my goodness, what was the person thinking that they did this merge or whatever? But in working with people, they almost always have good reasons in their mind for what they do. So the problems don't happen because of lack of intelligence either. But I have noticed over the years two significant reasons that these problems happen. And if you'll bear with me as I talk about these reasons, I just feel that they are so important because they represent widespread misconceptions. And if we can change those misconceptions, we could, I think, revolutionize the way family history is being done right now. And we could do away with a lot of the errors that we're seeing. And it's not just in family tree, to be honest. When I go into trees on other sites like Ancestry or Find My Past, many of those trees are also, they have quite a few errors in them. Of course, a lot of them are copied from tree to tree, so the errors just get perpetuated. But let's look at the misconceptions that lead to these errors in many cases. So one of the big ones, and Ron Tanner, the product manager for Family Search, has actually emphasized this a lot. If you've heard any of his Roots Tech presentations or different talks that he's given, and that is that either not realizing or possibly forgetting that Family's tree on the Family Search website is a shared tree. In other words, we're all in it together. We're all trying to create one tree of the human family. And so it's not like Ancestry or Find My Past or My Heritage, where you have a private tree, but instead everybody sees the same deceased people. And the important thing to remember is that our actions affect other users. So if you've got your private tree, you can put in experimental or unconfirmed data, and it doesn't matter because you probably intend to research it or you just don't want to lose it, you want to capture it. But when we put that kind of incorrect or questionable data into a shared tree, other people don't know that it's incorrect or questionable, and they start to build on it. Not only that, Family Search starts to give you hints about it. And so bad information in Family Tree tends to snowball. And that is actually not a weakness of Family Tree. Family Tree was designed to be a shared tree. So it's actually a weakness of the way that it's being used. So we always want to remember that whatever we do in the tree affects other users. Now, the other reason that has just been so interesting to me as I've been kind of watching family history progress. So I started teaching family history about 20 years ago, but I was doing a little bit of it before that time. And from the time that I was involved in family history, I noticed this problem. So if we think of, there's two extreme views that I want to talk about. And if we think of, people talk about the pendulum swinging back and forth. So if we have a family history pendulum, it used to largely be on this view. So there weren't very many people doing family history, and those that did often had the perception that everybody must follow strict, like professional rules and do genealogy, quote, right. And not only that, learning the rules required extensive training. I saw an example of that when I was helping my parents clean out their house. My mom's been into family history forever, since she was 16. Me, not so much. It's more recent. But when I cleaned out her house, I found a manual for a class that she had apparently taken back in like the 50s, the 1950s. Guess how long it was? 2 years. You might have thought I would say 2 weeks or 2 months, but seriously, it was 2 years. How many people are going to be able to spend 2 years to become prepared to do anything in family history? Probably not a lot of us, right? And so this view really did discourage a lot of people from becoming involved in family history, and people started to realize that. The trouble was, when they realized that, they went to the opposite extreme, which came with its own problems. Because of this emphasis over here on very strict rules, some people concluded that the average everyday person hates research, so it is wrong to make them do any kind of family history research. Or here's another favorite: research isn't needed anymore. Technology does it all. Here's one that just scares me, I'll be honest with you. And that is, don't tell people how they have to do family history. They'll figure it out. So that's a little like giving your car keys to a 15-and-a-half-year-old who hasn't taken driver's ed and saying, don't worry, go out on the freeway. You'll figure it out. Not going to happen, right? So there's that fear of that we're going to intimidate people if we instruct them at all. And then finally, the last point is, don't, and I've actually had several people say this to me, don't tell people about the problems in family tree or in ancestry or whatever, because it will just discourage them. What I've noticed is that when you don't tell people about the problems, they're going to find them out anyway, and then they're going to be even more frustrated because nobody warned them about the problems. So this, unfortunately, is largely the view that is being promulgated in the family search community, not by everyone. I don't want to make it sound like it's a totally this way. But unfortunately, there are a number of people who are encouraging this view. And so we'll see the kinds of problems that this view leads to. When we don't believe that we need to teach people, we believe the technology does it all, and don't tell people about the problems that they're likely to encounter. So you see those two opposites there. The pendulum has just kind of swung from one extreme to the other. But if we wanted a balanced view, it, in my mind, would look something like this. And this has been my experience as I've worked with probably hundreds of beginners over the last years, and that, or last couple of decades, I meant to say. People can learn to love and do family history, even family history research, if they're taught in a way that makes sense to them. Going along with that, people, in my experience, would rather know about the problems up front than learn the hard way. And it actually doesn't discourage them from getting involved in family history. They feel forewarned, and now they know better what to do. And then finally, a more balanced view is that technology is amazing, but it doesn't replace thought and common sense. So we are ready to dive into our examples. These are true life examples that I have worked with in Family Tree. And our first one is Seeking Ada Lancaster. So for those of you who have been on some of the other webinars that I've taught, you know that I love my Bescovy family, and I've been doing a lot of research on them. So I was doing descendancy research and going down, finding spouses and families for all the kids. And I had reached the point where I was to Ted Lancaster. And so I knew that I needed to find his wife. So I thought, especially in England, he lived at the time that he should have appeared married in the 1911 census. And so lo and behold, I found a guy that looked very much like him. Right name, right age, age 24, and he was even born in the right place, which is South Rousby. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but we'll say Rousby in Lincolnshire. Well, he had a wife named Ada. And so there she is. She's a little bit older than he is. And let's look at the points that we can find from the census. So wife's name is Ada. They were married about 1907 because here is the number of years married, which is 4. So I'm not real good at math, but I can handle this. 1911 minus 4 is about 1907. We learned that by calculating Ada's age, by subtracting 28 from the 1911 census year, that she was born about 1883 in a place called Little Gonerby, Grantham, Lincolnshire. And finally, they're living in Grantham, the same place that she was born. Well, jumping over to Ted's page, guess what? Family Search had a hint based on the information that we had, which was awesome. And so I look at this hint and I realize that it's lining up really well with the 1911 census. We've got the marriage year that we were expecting, 1907. The marriage location matches where the family was living 4 years later. And we've got the spouse's first name, Ada, and her age also match the information that we saw in the census. Not only that, as we look more at this record, we see that Ada is single and that her dad's surname is Slight. So we're pretty confident at this point that Ada's birth name is Slight. But for those of you who do much English research, you know that the birth registration indexes are online and very easy to search now. They give the mother's maiden name. So just for grins, I looked up the kids, George Edward and Herbert William, in the online index at the GRO site. And if you're interested in the GRO site, just Google General Register Office, and that's where they have the index that allows you to look up children's birth registrations with the mother's maiden name. Now, there are other sites, just a little tangent here. There are other sites that will give you the mother's maiden name sometimes, like FreeBMD or Find My Past. But the GRO index, in my experience, gives the longest range of mother's maiden surnames. So back to the task at hand, we look at this and we see that the mother's maiden name is Slight for these 2 boys. They're registered in the logical registration district of Grantham. So now we are very, very confident that Ada's full name is Ada Slight. So I go over to Ted. Oh, somebody has already attached her since the last time I looked. Well, that's good. We're working in a shared tree, right? And so we all collaborate together and somebody put somebody into a family that I was working on. That is wonderful, except I start to see some red flags. So the first one was that the dad's name didn't exactly match. Well, that's not that big of a deal. Maybe he was going by George on the marriage record, going by his middle name. But then I start looking a little bit more, and I noticed that the parents were born in Sussex, or excuse me, were married in Sussex in 1882. And Ada was born the next year in 83 in a completely different county. So in our modern age, that would totally not be a big deal. But back at this time in the 1800s, it was quite unusual, especially for my poor relatives. They were agricultural laborers and miners and so forth. They just did not move a lot. So they were born in a parish and lived there and married there, had kids there, and died there. That was the pattern that I was seeing for my family. Now, is it possible that they moved? Of course, absolutely possible, but very, very unlikely. So based on that, I decided I better pop over and look at Ada and see what's going on with her if I can get any clues. Well, look at the birthplace. It does not match the 1911 census. Well, so now we've got a question. Are we looking at an Ada Slight with accidentally the wrong birthplace, or could there be two women named Ada Slight? Now that's a very unusual name, right? It's not like Jane Smith or Sue Taylor or something that is more common, at least in English speaking countries. And so my task now is to find out, are there really two Ada Slights or are there just one and there's a mistake here? Well, long story short, did a little bit of searching and discovered the Ada Slight who was born in Worth, Sussex, living with her mom in the 1911. And remember that we already found the other Ada married in the 1911. So now we know that there are two different Ada Slights born about the same year, but born in completely different counties. So what had happened is somebody had apparently searched, they'd probably seen that marriage record is my guess. They had searched for an Ada Slight in family tree, found one, and just decided without looking too deep into it that that was the right Ada Slight. So they added her and then added all her kids, but it was the wrong Ada Slight. So what did I need to do to fix this? And I need to mention the point of this webinar is not to go deep into the steps of fixing, because there's other webinars that do that. What I'm trying to do, and I'll reference them by the way, but what I'm trying to do is illustrate how mistakes that just take us a few minutes to make, if we're not careful, can result in hours of cleanup. So this is what I needed to do to clean this up. I first had to search and see if the right Ada Slight really was in Family Tree, and she was not. And so I created a new record for her and put in the correct information. Then, in order to avoid future problems, especially since there had already been a confusion with the dad's name, right? Alfred George and George, I researched my Ada's correct parents and I added them and also added relevant sources to their records. So you can see now how the time is starting to add up. Then the task was to replace the wrong Ada with the right Ada as the wife of Ted and the mother of those kids. And then finally, even after I had done the repair, the wrong sources were attached to the other Ada. So then I needed to go through and delete all those sources that had been incorrectly attached to the wrong Ada and put them on the right Ada. So again, purpose of this webinar is high-level fixes, but if you'd like more details on fixing relationships, so the type of thing that I had to do to fix this problem, see this webinar called Getting Relationships Right in Family Tree. You can Google it and it will come up either on YouTube or the BYU Family History Library webinar index, and either of those places will give you access to this webinar. So let's do a time comparison. So I obviously did not watch the other user put the incorrect Ada with the TED in my family and attach the incorrect sources, but just based on past experience and how long it takes to search and attach, I'm guessing they probably spent about 10 minutes doing that. That would not have been a difficult thing. By the time I had finished making all the corrections to this problem, I would estimate that it took me about 1.5 to 2 hours. So let's hypothetically say what would have happened if we hadn't gone this route, if we'd done a little bit more investment of time up front to find out, find out what was correct. So if I'd been doing this, I would have done a search just like the other person, and I would have come up undoubtedly with that wrong Ada. But then I would have taken a few more minutes to say, okay, do the birthplaces match? Do the parents match? And I would have noticed those red flags. And so then I would have checked the census and so forth and seen that, yeah, there indeed are two different women born in two different places. I would estimate based on my experience that because this is a very easy time period to research, probably would have taken max 30 minutes to determine which Ada was correct and that the correct one wasn't in the system, and then to add her and attach the sources. But then look what happens later on. There's no time spent to fix associated problems. So even though it took us more time up front, we saved a lot of time in the long run. And that's the whole point that we're trying to make. So how could this problem be avoided in the future? The most important thing in this case was not to assume that two people with the same name are the same person. And honestly, this is a problem that I see as a cause of almost all the incorrect merges that are done in family tree. People look at the name and they might look at some other information, but they decide that the name is a good enough reason to believe they're the same person despite other contradictory information. So you always want to compare the birth date, the birthplace, and family relationships. And then also, when you add somebody, you want to add information, relationships, and sources that help uniquely identify that person so it's harder to make these types of mistakes. So somebody can look at it and go, oh, I can see very clearly that these are two separate families, two separate spouses, parents, siblings, whatever. The more correct information we add to somebody in family tree, the less likely that they will be confused with another person with the same or similar name and similar maybe birth information. Okay, let's take a look at example number 2, and I'm going to take a drink here. A drink of water. Okay, so example number 2, Double Trouble with James McVeigh. I was helping a friend research on this line and she was stuck. And so we said, let's put our heads together and see if we can figure out what's going on. So her relative was this James McVeigh, born in 1837 in Indiana, United States. He does not have a spouse in family tree, but my friend had found a marriage record. Oh, and I should point out that in family tree, the parents were Benjamin McVeigh and Mary Klein, no spouse, as we said. But my friend had found a marriage record showing that James McVeigh married Mary Hoagland. And so, but it didn't have parents on the marriage record. And I think I'm going to point that out later actually too. But my friend was like, how do I know for sure that this is the right James McVeigh? In other words, that this James McVeigh on my line really did marry Mary Hoagland. And can we be confident in tracing that line forward? Well, we looked in family tree and guess what we found? We found that there was another James McVeigh. I almost said duplicate, but at this point, we don't know if he's a duplicate. So there is another James McVeigh in family tree, and he does have Mary Hoagland attached as a spouse. But you notice difference in this. I know the screen is really small. If you're on a small screen, you might not be able to read this, but let me just go back and point out that the parents of the James McVeigh on my friend's line were Benjamin and Mary, but the parents listed for this James McVeigh with Mary Hoagland are George and Sarah. So there's no way that George and Sarah are going to get mixed up with Benjamin and Mary, right? That's a lot different than George and George Alfred. So, or George Albert, whichever one it was. But so now we're thinking, okay, what's going on here? There's probably two different James William McVeighs because we've got two sets of parents, even though they're both in Indiana, but which one really married Mary Hoagland, because the marriage record doesn't tell us the parents. And another thing we noticed is, you remember the guy on her line was born in 1837, but this guy is born in 1831. Now, if it's just been a couple of years, who cares about that, right? Because censuses can be off by a year or two, but a gap of 6 years, that starts to be substantial. So we're thinking we better look into this. So the key questions that we want to answer are, did our James, the one that we first looked at that currently had no spouse in family tree, did that guy marry Mary Hoagland? And what year was he really born? Was it 31 or 37? And who were his parents? Are they correct in was Benjamin and Mary correct? Were Benjamin and Mary correct? Or have there been some bad merges and actually George and Sarah are correct? So we've got to figure out what's going on here. So we are going to dig a little deeper. Now remember, there's no parents on the marriage record, but we did notice that the marriage took place in Jennings County. So that may turn out to be significant. So we decided that our strategy, because we were researching in the United States in the mid 1800s, we would try to follow both men through the census using a principle that I love, that has helped me so many times in solving problems. And that is to use what we know to discover what we don't know, or in other words, what we want to find out. So what do we know? Let's take stock of what we've just seen on those two James McVeighs in Family Tree. We know there's two of them. We know they're both born in Indiana. One is born about 1831. The other's born about 1837. One of them is the son of Benjamin and Mary. One of them is the son of George and Sarah. And one of them probably married Mary Hoagland. This is what we know so far. So now we're going to hop over to the census, and we're going to use a tool called the timeline grid. Now, if you're not familiar with the timeline grid, it's actually just a very simple template that allows you to easily gather information from censuses. So it's used in countries that have regular censuses. So the way it works, just briefly, and I'll give you a link to more information in a few slides, but we have a column for every census, and we have a row for every person that is a member of that family. So I started out by looking for James with parents of George and Sarah in Indiana, and they were pretty easy to find in the 1850 census. There's James, he's a farmer, there's his parents, and they're living in Green, Hancock, Indiana. We keep tracing them through. Here they are in the 1860. James is still with them. Oh, did you notice something? I actually don't remember if we pointed this out. Let me pop back to the marriage record. When were they married? This James and Mary Hoagland. They were married in 55. So the fact that this guy, let's get back to our timeline grid, the fact that this guy is still single in 1860 is our first clue that he probably did not marry Mary Hoagland. So we keep following them through. Oh, next census, James is not with his family. At this time period, the most likely reason is that he got married. And indeed, we find that James. So here is James. You notice how he's aging consistently. So that means he's born about 1831. Well, except this part isn't consistent. He's pretty consistent up to this point, and then the ages get wonky. But you may have noticed that that does happen with these censuses a lot of times, because back then people either didn't care about their age, or some people were illiterate and actually at a point in time didn't really know their age. You know, it's easy if you're 5 to know your age, but if you're 55, the years just all start blending together. So the reason I was confident that these were the same people, despite the age discrepancy, is they were living in the same place, had the same wife, and and following them through, we still, everything was consistent, except the ages were a little bit wonky. And so, and actually, now that I look at that, I apologize. I had forgotten we're dealing with the United States where the 1890 is missing. So we actually would expect a 20-year gap between this census and this census. So really it's this one that got wonky where he's only aged a year from 1870 to 1880. So it does look like the James who was born in 31, who was the son of George and Sarah, married a woman named Sarah sometime between 1860 and 1870. And the other thing to notice is that he consistently lived in the township of Greene in Hancock, Indiana. So he didn't go far, which, given the fact that he and his dad were both farmers, that makes sense, right? Because they obtained some land, they farmed it, and they stuck with it. Farmers would change in the case of crop failure, as you know, but you know, from our history and stuff. But if things were going well and there wasn't a reason for them to leave, they would just keep working the same farmland. So it's not surprising that that family stayed in the township of Greene all those years. Okay, so just to summarize, it's looking like James McVeigh was born about 31. He's the guy that lived in Greene, son of George and Sarah, and he married a woman named Sarah, maiden surname unknown at this point. Now let's try and trace the other guy. So again, it was fairly easy to find James McVeigh as a son in the census with a mother Mary and a father Benjamin. And this guy was born about 1837. When we go to the next census, he's not with the family, which totally fits because remember the marriage to Mary Hoagland took place in 1855. So we would expect him not to still be with his parents here, but to be with his wife. And that is exactly what happened. We find him living just a short distance away with a woman named Mary, and they've got some kids here. Follow them through the census. Everything's pretty consistent. The clincher was that I was lucky enough to find an obituary for Mary, and it proved that the Mary that married this James McVeigh was Mary Hoagland. So, and oh, and notice I did want to point out their pattern of residence. So the family started out in Lancaster, Jefferson, Indiana. By 1860, James was still in Lancaster. So I don't know if he started working his dad's farm and his dad retired or whatever. I mean, we could speculate, right? But we don't really know. But James had moved over to a place called Bigger in Jennings County. And at first I was a little bit worried about that. But then just because it sounds like it could potentially be far away, turns out that it's actually not. And I'll show you a Google map in a second. But then later on, James and his wife moved to Delaware still in Indiana, and they stayed in that area for the rest of their lives. So here is the thing. I Googled how far is Bigger from Lancaster, and it turns out that it's only about 11 miles. So that's pretty realistic. I feel like, okay, if the parents and the kid were only 11 miles apart. Oh, and by the way, Greene is quite a distance from this place, the other James McVeigh. So we're feeling pretty comfortable that that the son and the father, if they're only 11 miles apart, it's still the same family. So for more information on the timeline grid, if you looked at that and said, oh my gosh, I'd like to learn more. How did you fill that out? You know, what do all these abbreviations mean? Go to tinyurl.com slash timeline hyphen grid. And that will give you access to a lot of information, including some webinars and also to free templates. So what do we know now? We have established that there are two different James McVeighs. One was born in 31, lived in Greene, son of George and Sarah, married Sarah. The other one that we just researched, born in 37, lived in Lancaster, son of Benjamin and Mary, married Mary Hoagland. So now let's go back and see how this compares to family tree. Uh-oh. So the first problem is this James McVeigh that is currently attached to Mary Hoagland has a birth date of 1831, but we know that our guy is the 37 guy. Not only that, he's got the wrong parents. He's got George and Sarah, and we know that the son of George and Sarah married a woman named Sarah and not Mary. So the next suspicion in my mind is that there's been some bad merges. And as it turns out, oh, and I'm getting ahead of myself. So the trick to untangling bad merges, one of the keys to it is to figure out who the person was intended to be when they were first added to family tree. So in other words, I want to go into James's changelog. And so the way you get there is over on the right-hand side of the person page, go to the latest changes box, and then there's a link that says show all, I believe, or show all changes. So you click that and you get into the changelog, scroll clear to the bottom because it's in reverse date order, and then you can tell very often who that person was intended to be when they were created. And so we've got a conflict here because we know the son of George and Sarah was not the one that married Mary Hoagland. So was this guy meant to be Mary Hoagland's husband or meant to be George and Sarah's son? Well, long story short, got in the changelog and found that there had been a bad merge. So this is what it took to clean up this family. So went into the changelog, looked for the bad merge and found one. When I undid it, I found that it actually was the son of Benjamin and Mary. So the son of Benjamin and Mary had been merged with the son of George and Sarah, which again is a little understandable, right? Because they had the same name and the same birthplace, even though the birth years were off. But it just goes to show that we've got to do at least a little bit of due diligence before assuming that two people with the same name are really the same person. So by the time I had researched and researched that bad merge and undone it, that was already a bit of time. And so then we needed to, it turned out there was that other James in the system. So I had to the one that I had just, this is complicated to explain. The one that I had just unmerged had to be merged with a real duplicate. So merged him with the real duplicate, and that resulted in even more duplicates in the family that had to be merged. So you can see that the time is starting to add up here. And then I wanted to go back and add more information to the James that turned out not to be mine to avoid future bad merges. And so I feel like that's a best practice to do. If you have undone a bad merge, then do your best to document both the people that you've undone so that the bad merge does not repeat itself in the future or is not repeated. And then the last thing was, as probably some of you have experienced, when you undo a bad merge, and by undo, I mean restore a deleted person. So I don't want to get too deep into this, but there's two ways of unmerging. If you've merged somebody and no changes have been made, you can just click on merge in the changelog and both records go back to the way they were. But if a merge has been done on two people and changes have been made since the merge, you cannot unmerge them. In other words, that unmerge button is vanished. There's nothing to click. But you can restore a deleted person. Now, the reason Family Tree doesn't let you unmerge people if changes have been made is that it doesn't know where to put those changes that were made since the merge. So it will let you restore a deleted person. It will not let you unmerge that bad merge if changes have been made. Well, the result of that is that the sources stay on the incorrect person. So you have to go through when you undo a bad merge by restoring a deleted person, you have to go through and manually fix all the sources that are incorrectly attached. Now, once again, the purpose was not to go deep into how to do all this stuff. We're really trying to just show the illustration of how mistakes can be made very quickly that take hours to fix. But if you'd like more information on fixing incorrect merges, then go to this webinar, Fixing Incorrect Merges in Family Tree. So here's the time comparison. My guess, again, I didn't watch the person do it, but my guess is that to merge those two incorrect James McVeighs probably took 3 to 5 minutes, more likely 3. How much time did I spend fixing the problems caused by the bad merge? Probably about 3 to 3.5 hours. So what if the research had been done up front to avoid the bad merge? Well, this one was a little tricky, right? We walked through those 2 timeline grids and we had to examine them in the census so that we could see that they were really 2 different people. We had to see how the marriage record compared to whether they were single in the census, just that kind of sanity checking. So I would estimate that well, I can estimate based on the timeline grids, it probably took me, I don't know, about 45 minutes to create those 2 timeline grids. But then I would have had to attach sources and that kind of thing. So I'm estimating that to do it right in the first place probably would have taken me an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So it would have taken some time and it would have taken some thought. But I keep going back to what President Nelson said. For those of you who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and or watched General Conference recently, President Nelson said, the Lord loves effort. And it's a true thing in life. Effort brings great rewards. And so by putting in that effort ahead of time, and you notice that it really wasn't that hard, right? We just looked at the census and looked at the marriage records. So it's not like we were, deep into finding these obscure wills or land records or things that are hard to use. We just used very simple, commonly available records, and we would have been able to find out who that person was. And if this had been done ahead of time, that bad merge could have been avoided. And then the time spent fixing the problems would be 0. And so you can see still that even though it took a little more time up front, it was worth it in the long run because we saved time. So how do we avoid this type of problem in the future? Again, are you seeing the common theme here? Don't assume that 2 people with the same name are the same person, but instead compare their birth date, their birthplace, and family relationships. Another huge one is don't merge unless you're absolutely certain that the 2 records represent the same person. Okay, I have to tell you something really funny that a friend of mine shared with me the other day. She emailed me and said, I just found this reason statement on a merge. And the person had written this, everything matches but the name. And so it was clear that the 2 people were different people, but the person had merged them together anyway because all the other stuff matched. And so again, you want to be so careful when doing merging, just to be sure that those 2 people you're merging really do represent the same human being. And in order for them to represent the same human being, the information should be basically identical. And also add information, relationships, and sources that help uniquely identify the person so that it's less likely that bad merges will be made. Okay, so those are our 2 examples, and I hope that's been helpful to kind of underpin the concern that I expressed at the beginning, that when we feel like shortcuts are appropriate or even necessary, or just that research isn't required, it always comes with a cost. And the person who makes the mistake may not pay that cost, but somebody has to pay the cost of cleaning it up. And it's just so much better. And frankly, it's a lot more fun to do it right in the first place than to have to clean up a mess later on. So here's some final advice. The big one that I would recommend is to slow down. Sometimes, especially as members of the church who feel that temple work is a huge imperative, we can tend to cut corners and justify it by saying, well, we just have to hurry and get the temple work done. But what is the point of rushing if you do wrong temple work that is just going to have to be redone later on anyway? And even if you aren't into temple work, if you're not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or it's just not your thing at this point in time, you do family history in other ways, still it's better to slow down and not make mistakes. It's just all around better, because the whole point of doing family history is to have an accurate record of your family, right? So it's okay to slow down. We don't have to feel guilty for slowing down. So instead of this huge race dashing through these tunnels and whatever at breakneck speed, instead think of family history a little bit more like this. It's a beautiful journey that's got lovely scenery around it, and it's okay to take it at a reasonable pace. We don't have to be rushing and killing ourselves, and in the process, introducing a lot of incorrect information into our family trees. Another thing is to learn to love and do research. So again, as I mentioned, I think it's one of the most dangerous misconceptions in the family history community today that people are being told that research is not necessary. That's a little bit like telling a doctor that it's not necessary for him to go to medical school. Research is how you do family history. And so to if we could just get rid of those old misconceptions that research is horrible and too hard. And in the olden days, frankly, it was hard a lot of the times. Imagine looking at a census on microfilm, right? Instead of being able to search and just bring up a name immediately. I'm guessing that people on this call or people watching the webinar later remember the soreness of their arms as they went down to the family history library and wound those microfilms over and over. So it did used to be a bit more difficult, truthfully, but not so much anymore. It's more like an exciting puzzle. So if we learn to love and do research, that will also help forestall a lot of those problems. And then finally, I think one of the key things is to remember that we really are dealing with real people here. I remember hearing some youth talk about working in Family Tree as if it was a video game. And I just felt like, oh my goodness, they have been, and I don't fault them. I believe that they were taught incorrectly. And actually, as I listened to them talk, it kind of became clear that they were kind of taught, I guess somebody very well meaning said, oh, in order to engage youth in family history, we have to make it fun. We have to turn it into a game. So as a result, they were actually going in and just making all kinds of messes and problems because it looked like a video game and they were just clicking here, clicking there, merging there, doing whatever. And they had lost sight of the fact that the records in Family Tree represent real human beings, real people who had lives and loves and tragedies and trials and lived on the earth just the same as we did. So behind all those names, all those disconnected puzzle pieces are genuine people. And this work, for those of us who feel connected to our ancestors on the other side, we know that this work is important to them. And so to do it accurately and carefully and to put the time into it that lets our records and our family trees be accurate is a wonderful way of paying tribute to them. And I have to believe that they appreciate it. So, in conclusion, when we invest research time up front, we avoid spending much more time on repairs. And even if it could be a little challenging or a little time consuming, we definitely save time for ourselves and others in the long run. So, by way of summary, we talked about the principle of paying now or paying later with interest. We reviewed two preventable problems, and we gave some final advice: slow down, learn to love and do research, and remember that in family history, we're dealing with real people. So that brings us to the end of the webinar, and I see that we've got 2 questions in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and address those, and then we'll check and see if there were any questions in the chat that need to be addressed. So I'm opening up the Q&A, and Steve says, can you repeat that URL, please? Steve, I am so sorry. At this point, I don't know which URL you're referring to. Would you mind putting in the, maybe put another question to tell me which site you wanted the URL to? And so Darrell made a comment here. She says, when I teach a family history class, this is what I suggest. They learn something about the geographic area in which the family lived, such as jobs, travel, naming customs. Love that. Number 2, how did they live? Again, what were some customs, foods, industries? Some people had to grow everything they ate and wore. And she says that census records are great for tracing movements where people either moved or did not move far from where they were born. And then last, she says, learn the fundamentals of family history research. Just take a little bit of time each week to take a class, or go to the family history guide, which Darrell recommended. It's thefhguide.com. They've got a lot of awesome resources there. So Darrell, thank you very much for that great comment. And Michael, thank you. You said the timeline grid URL. Let me go back. Well, actually, I know it. It is, if you go to tinyurl.com/timeline, so all one word, TIMELINE hyphen grid. And you know what, actually, I can throw that in the chat. That might be the easiest way to do, because then it will be clickable. So let me just open that up, and we will go HTTPS. Oh. Okay, so that, oh, I just sent it to the hosts and panelists. I always do that, you guys. I forget to set it to everybody. Let me change the Zoom setting to everybody. And so this URL that I just put into the chat will take you straight to the timeline grid page. So, and I see actually that my cousin Gordon is online. Hi, cousin Gordon. And he put in the chat the URL to my site that has links to my slide decks, as well as to the timeline grid information. So that is another way of getting to that information. So Anna, do we have any other questions in the chat that we need to address? Because I haven't looked at the whole chat.
No, just someone said that she wants you to know that she has many ancestors from Forest Row. Furthermore, her dad's cricket team often played there. It's a beautiful countryside.
Oh, that's awesome. Very cool. Thanks for letting us know that.
Yeah, that should be it. So I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
And thank you, Kathryn, for that wonderful presentation. I feel like I know so much better how to not make mistakes.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we hope you will join us for our next webinar, which will be on October 20th. Watch out for the 6 Dangerous DNA Myths, Part 1 with James Baker. And a recording of this webinar will be made available next week. And you can view that on our YouTube channel or our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.